That's me.
Thanks for being here. Okay, great. So Kathleen, would you like to take the first shot at this?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, David. And again, Rick, thanks for laying some amazing foundational premises for us to consider. So when I think about, again, the notion of wicked problems and the connection to fairness, that matters a lot to someone who has spent the last 25 years in public education structures, primarily working with secondary students with a focus on middle school. And if you've ever had a middle school student, or if you've been around a middle school student, you know that fairness is something that comes up quite a lot. And Elizabeth, I was thrilled that you mentioned the idea around food equity. That's actually a part of the story that I have in a middle school where I got to be a principal in downtown Denver. But Rick, to your question, connecting wicked problems to fairness and helping others sort out all of the details around things that are radically unfair is something that really struck me about the piece.
Thank you. Linda, would you like to go next?
Sure. Sure. What came to mind when I was reading Rick's post about inequity was, well, where do you start? One of the things that comes to mind is, like so many of my students, I'm first generation. My parents came from the old country, and English was not my first language. And so I identify with the so many of the students. And to me, one of the big questions, and Kathleen, I so appreciate your background in this, is how do we communicate, how do we uplift these students so that they recognize they have dignity and worth and have something to add to the conversation? I certainly think there are ways to do that in the classroom by, giving a supportive atmosphere. And there are a lot of companies that are working towards that so that we have a rich, diverse perspective. There are, with that being said, we still have room to grow. So that's what came to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Carolyn, would you like to go next?
I'm sorry, who?
You?
Oh, yes. So as you were talking about this, Linda, I'm also a first generation American. My father came from Russia. He was brought here as a child. And my mother was brought here as a child from Poland. And it's so amazing to me how, because of the certain political factors in the last many years, people seem to be becoming more suspicious and more racist towards immigrants. And I keep saying to everyone, we're all a country of immigrants. So why is it so mysterious that none of us would be here if it weren't for immigration? And the racism that seems to be getting so much worse, those are the things that bother me deeply. And I just keep trying to think of, besides writing as many articles as I can, speaking up wherever I encounter it, what can we do as a community to make it clear that this is not okay, and we so value and embrace and are grateful for people who have different colors of skin, who have different ethnic backgrounds, because without our diversity, we would be so much more ignorant than we already are.
Awesome. Thank you. Elizabeth, would you like to share your take?
Well, first, thanks, Rick, for the great writing again, and for laying out the issues. What comes to mind, the indigenous wisdom that is articulated in the piece, and also just thinking about, how do we get to a holistic, healthy, equitable world. And and I appreciate the nod to the female archetype, but I also think and appreciate that we've got wonderful men here with us as well, who recognize that these characteristics, this energy, which is really about energy, that this has the potential to shift us towards the we world. I mean, I think what women bring consistently, and what that female energy, and it can be channeled through men as well, is this inclusive, that it's not just, oh, I'm okay, and I've managed to get through, but there's billions of other people who have not. I sort of set up this construct of, really, it's about channeling the energy of we, and I'd like to put that on the table here for dialogue, because if I'm okay but my neighbor's not okay, I'm living in a pretty unsustainable environment, whether it be a country, think of a country as a neighbor, whether we think about our physical neighbors. We will not have the world we want, or resolve these wicked problems, whether they be around equitable food, or environmental justice, or issues of war, or the sort of emerging war on on labor, and just the economic framework as well. So I will pause there. I could say a lot more, but thanks, Rick, for teeing up so many important and interesting problems in the pre-read.
Well, thank you. I put definitions of equity and equity governance, brief definitions, so it gives a grounding for at least somewhat of a shared understanding about what those terms mean. But actually, I want to turn to Kathleen now, because we had a conversation on Zoom call, and she told me a little bit of a story, and I thought, wow, there's something in there. So I said, Kathleen, would you like to share your story? I don't even know it yet, but I knew there was enough there to say, wow, this is a wow story. So I don't want to set you up too much, Kathleen, but we did have a conversation yesterday, and I thought, boy, am I interested in hearing this story. So maybe you could, about 10 minutes, give us an overview of your most important awakening about inequity.
I would love to. And I have to say, even in this moment, and this has been several years ago, this still feels like a wow story to me. And when I think about the definitions of equity, inequity, access, wicked problems, fairness, all of that, I just, and Rick can attest to the fact he wasn't even done with the invitation, and I was saying, please, I have to tell you what happened. And this truly was this was absolutely a wake-up call for me in an educational leadership role. So anyway, my family and I lived in the Denver area for many years, or Colorado area, followed a relatively traditional school leadership journey. I was an early childhood teacher. I've had the privilege of working with students at every grade level, all the way from preschool through post-secondary. And an important stop along that journey was as a middle school principal. And I remember very distinctly, we were living and working in Colorado Springs, which, if you're familiar with Colorado, just sort of a suburban area. It's where the Air Force Academy is. It's south of Denver by an hour or so. And I was in an assistant principal role. And those of you on leadership pathways know that you get to a point where you think, I'm ready. You get the twinge. I'm ready to take on another opportunity. And I was sitting with my husband, random evening, we're watching TV, and I'm reading the Denver Post. And over my shoulder, he sees the article that I'm reading, which was about a school called Smiley Middle School. And my husband, who was, I freely admit my bias, but one of the best school leaders, district leaders I ever had the chance to work with. He was a special education teacher, a coach, also followed a pretty traditional pathway. He was reading over my shoulder about Smiley, and Smiley was a school that was in trouble. Smiley is located in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Denver, called the 5 Points neighborhood. It was heavily impacted by gangs. When I think about, Carolyn, what you and Linda both shared about being first generation, Smiley is the opposite of that. It is generational poverty, family after family after family after family, almost exclusively Black families in the 5 Points neighborhood. So he's reading over my shoulder and he just said, "Sister, you don't have to go to the hardest school in the state. Like, the work is hard enough no matter where you go." And we were both working in a pretty impacted district at the time. And I knew in my heart that I was going to be at Smiley Middle School. It was the only principalship that I sought. It was the only one I wanted. Smiley is located at 25th and Holly in Denver, and I grew up on Holly Drive. And so I knew as soon as I saw the address, like, I'm going to Smiley. So anyway, as luck would have it, I had the opportunity a few weeks prior to that to meet the superintendent in Denver. Superintendent at the time was Michael Bennett. Michael Bennett is now a senator in the state of Colorado, someone who's got a national reputation in the realm of equity. And I really, really wanted to work with Michael. He was featured in a New Yorker article that I read, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have to work with this person. So I had the honor of being hired by Michael into this incredibly impossible role. Smiley was a school that had lost its principal. Principal literally like walked off the field, disappeared under the cover of night based on the complexities of the school. And so the school had been without a leader for months. And if you think about middle school, again, a lot of people don't like to think back to middle school because it's not often the best experience. But for me, that was where my heart was, with the hardest to serve kids, hardest to staff, buildings and roles and all of that. And I remember being invited by a wonderful woman named Pat Slaughter, who became such a key mentor for me in the course of my time in Denver. She took a risk on me. She took a risk on a white female leader coming out of a suburban context to come into the heart of Denver, into the lowest performing school in the state of Colorado that had been, you drive up to the building, it's this beautiful, beautiful 1928 year built building that couldn't be more breathtaking. And, there are bars on the windows, there are bullet holes in the windows. The yard is a mess. It's just completely ravaged by context and by circumstance. And I rolled up at Smiley, and of course, steel door in the front and all that type of thing. And I remember walking in there for my interview. And the first thing I noticed was half the students were out of uniform. I walked in and there were students giving each other piggyback rides. They had super soaker water guns in the hallway. And this was not at the end of the school year. This was in March. And I thought, okay, and no stranger to middle school behavior at every level, not only as a student, but as a teacher and as a school leader. The students stopped and they were curious about me, like, wow, what are you doing here? What do you want? What do you need? And slowly, as I was on the tour with kids, they started to tell me the story of their school. And, they were, once they knew I was a principal candidate, they were asking questions about, are you going to make us wear uniforms? Are you going to make us, carry, are you going to let us have backpacks? Can we access our lockers again? All that type of thing. Pretty typical for that type of interview. So anyway, I'm with the kids, which is always the most important and compelling part of an interview process. So I'm with the students, and I'll never forget this. There was one of my girls named Angelique who walked. She said, "Can I show you something?" And I said, yes, because I was asking all the questions about, do you feel trusted? Do you feel valued? Do you feel seen? Do you have, someone that you have an adult that you could trust, that you could talk with? Angelique walked me, and I'm covered in goosebumps right now remembering this. She walked me into one of the girls' restrooms, and all of the doors had been taken off of the stalls of the bathrooms because
Mm.
the leaders at the time did not even trust the kids to have any privacy ever at any point during their days. And I was so struck in that moment by this beautiful seventh grade girl at the time. I got to have her for the 2 years that I was there, who just said, "Can you help us?" And I remember in that moment, like I pledged, I'm going to do my very best. I'm going to get this job and I'm going to show up for this school. And I have to say, it was the most rewarding experience I think I've ever had. So fast forward a little bit. So I had the opportunity to accept the position. And I having been in the staffing realm for many years, I do understand that Pat, my instructional superintendent, was just thrilled that someone wanted the job. I mean, there weren't a whole lot of people in Denver who knew the Smiley story that were even willing to do it because they knew the neighborhood, and I was just naive enough to not even know the radical inequities that it was about to face. But I was willing to run into it, and I would do the same thing 100 times over. So fast forward, that was March when I got the offer. My mom died 3 days before I started as the principal at Smiley. And so my parents, like my biggest supporters, it was just a complex time. And the needs of that community were the most important. That was my most important healing process. It sharpened my focus on what the issues were at hand. And to give you an idea of the first few weeks, even in the building, I took a handgun away from a student on the first day with kids and parents. I was sitting in my office and I heard when you hear things, when you feel the barometer drop with kids, you know that something's going on. And I look out my window and one of my eighth grade boys was holding a family at gunpoint. And that was my first day with students at Smiley. And I remember thinking, this is going to be a critical moment in my leadership here. And I stepped out of my office. Thankfully, there was a door that led me right outside. And with the student, just stepped in front and said, that's just not the way we're going to do things here anymore. And we were able to, avert that. And again, I'm thinking, wow. And you know how sometimes you're emboldened by grief, you're emboldened by this scenario can't possibly be happening. So you just step in and do something about it. And that continued for probably the first year that I was in that building. Every day there was a gun, there was a knife, there was a drug sale, there was, a fight, there was something. And I was greatly blessed by my wonderful school resource officers and the Denver PD. But that was Smiley, just to give you some context. And, so these were kids that had been, like 40% of the population were students with special education support plans, with IEPs. This was a school where if you didn't have any other way to get to a different school, this is where you came. So it was all the neighborhood kids. So again, fast forward, end of the first year, I non-renewed 40% of the staff that was there because of the way that they treated students, because of the way that they talked to students in ways that were so incredibly disrespectful and inequitable. So immediately I was not the most popular person I was really popular with kids and families. I wasn't necessarily popular with staff. But something magical happens when you make hard decisions about what's going on with performance and how people are being treated with equity or not. So in the first year, we were able to secure, like if you can picture a building that was built before 1930, asbestos everywhere, there were adults with cancer throughout the building. We are convinced that it's because of the water they were drinking that was coming out of the building, all of that. So anyway, we got funding to do things like we painted everything. The first thing I did was get stall doors back on every bathroom door for kids that was possible. We brightened things up. We painted the lockers. We replaced small things like the benches out in front of the building. We got those replaced. We got good trash cans that were clean and organized out front and all of that. And so we were on a great pathway. So Smiley, and I'm Rick, I'm just about to the equity challenge here in just a second. At Smiley, old building, didn't have air conditioning, 3-story building. So in Denver, in the beginning of the school year, it is hot. It is so hot. And on the 3rd floor in my building, there were students who were trying to learn in like 90, 95-degree temperatures. No one learns at 95 degrees at all. And so it was just one of those places where we were scratching and clawing to just get the basic needs met of our kids. We paid for their uniforms. We paid for all of their meals. They could eat 3 meals every day at school if they wanted to. So we were making great progress. Okay, so fast forward again. Denver went through a gentrification process. And if you know Denver again, there's an area called Stapleton, which even in and of itself, the Stapleton name carries a lot of equity and racial baggage. But anyway, Stapleton, where the old airport was, which is kind of just east of Midtown, it's called the Near Northeast in Denver. There were a lot of white families moving in. 99% of my students were Black. I think I had 2 white students and a handful of Latinx students. And so anyway, people caught wind of what we were doing at Smiley. We were in the process of becoming an international baccalaureate school. We had gone from being the lowest performing middle school in the state to attaining performance status on the state framework based on math and language arts outcomes. People liked the sound of that. And so that attracted people from that other neighborhood. And so the district, and this is, Rick, this is what I was sharing with you. I'll never forget it. I was sitting in a meeting in the superintendent's office, and we were talking about boundary changes and that type of thing. And something came up. I had not been made aware of it ahead of time. They were going to change the boundaries for my school, which meant that all of the white families from the east side of town were then going to be invited into my neighborhood. And this was my equity wake-up call. I looked at my boss, and we had a great relationship, didn't even need to say anything. Like, is this happening right now? And she gave me the kind of the raised eyebrow, like, welcome to inequitable practices. And what happened over the course of the next 2 years was the school became completely bereft of Black students. The Black students did not feel welcomed there. The white families didn't want the Black students to be there. They wanted an international baccalaureate school where they felt like their kids were going to get the best of the best. And what really pushed me over the top was while my kids were still there, while all of my Black families and Black students were still there, the district sent the HVAC crews in to install air conditioning, to change out all of the pipes for water. They replaced all of the bathrooms. They redid the entire school. And they did that just in time for the white families to begin attending school there. And it was one of the most, like, that was a clarion call moment for me, that the rest of my career was going to be dedicated to excavating inequities, to demanding food justice for kids, to demanding that all of the students in the Denver area, and I still work with, my gosh, I think I've got upwards of 30 people that I still coach and work with in the Denver area around these practices. But it was in that moment where my naivete dissipated in that moment. And I thought, okay, this is the way things work for people who look like my kids and my families. And the saddest part, honestly, for me was being in the building when they had the crews working there, and the kids were looking at me like, they're putting air conditioning in. Like, every generation of my family has attended the school at 90 degrees, and this is what's happening now. It was really a tough scenario, and that school still exists the way that they set it up to exist today. And it's something that became a driving force in my work in terms of how to identify, address, respond to, and just be incredibly candid about the things that happen to kids. And those kids go on to become the people that we're working with, the people that we are hiring, the people that we are supporting. And Linda, in your post-secondary work, I know that you have to see this all the time. But and Elizabeth, when you mentioned food justice, we created a garden in the backyard at Smiley where students were able to take, harvest and take home healthy greens, healthy foods, all of that. And just in one decision around air conditioning, that was all taken away from that community. And so, Rick, that was my wake-up call in the realm of equity. And it's something I think about every hour of every day, and still remain in touch with a lot of my kids from that time. But it was an important awakening for me in equity work.
Wow. Thank you very much, Kathleen. Very much in the spirit of an equity muse, but I think we'll just leave it open for discussion. We've got about 20 minutes left. And actually, I don't know whether, Teresa, whether you would like to respond first. If you don't, that's fine. But would you like to respond? Because I'm sure you have a perspective on this issue. If you feel like it. If you don't, that's fine. We can let somebody else speak first.
Now, I can't really speak to a lot of that because I think I was one of the more blessed folks. It makes me angry, but I never had to go through anything like that. And I'm open to do whatever I can to help as well. But I can't speak to it because I've never been in situations like that.
Linda, go for it.
It's more of a question for Kathleen. So this was so I sure appreciate the wake up call. Did that? I'm curious what happened after you saw this. Did you feel like you needed to leave and start all over? What did you do there? And is there something you would look back and say, oh, I might do that differently? I'm not suggesting that you should have, because God only knows I've had those kind of wake up calls where I look back and I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this and take away from it? So, but I was curious. The school has continued that way. Were you able, how did you deal with what you saw?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Preeti has something to add as well. So just really quickly, Linda, in response to your question, ironically, I had been recruited to join the human resources team just before this happened. And so they pulled me out of my building and I went to work for the central office, which is not something, I wish I'd had more years at that school, but what I was able to do was directly influence, like my team of 17 people. We had around 200 schools in Denver at the time. We were directly responsible for staffing and ensuring that we had the highest quality teachers in the schools that needed the most support. I assuage my own regret by saying that was the impact that I had. And I know in my heart and understood consequently both, that the leader of a building has the greatest impact of anyone else. And I really wanted to do the HR work to have a broader impact. Had I stayed at the school, I think that things would have turned out differently. And that's something that I live with every day. And now coach my principals around, you have the greatest influence on the work that you do for kids every day, and don't try to talk yourself out of that.
That's great. Thank you.
Other questions? Lessons learned?
I think Brady wanted to make a comment, right, Brady?
Yeah, I just want to give you the Indian perspective and with my own story. In short, see, as I told you that I am a Parkinson's patient, and when I had to teach to my students who are the graduate students, the engineering BTech students. undergraduate engineering students. So that time, I had to prepare myself a lot in terms of the speech, in terms of the body language, because see, now also you can see my hands are shaking. But when it used to come to the equity part, then my students were quite matured enough to understand that what their faculty is going through, and they used to be very cooperative with me. And then we had a very nice bonding with each other. And I have developed a new concept of buddy, because I used to deal with 250 students, and out of which 10-15 volunteers used to come, used to help out to me, and they used to be the intermediate contact for both of us. For me, doing this and with the students, with support the students. I mean, during pandemic also, it was quite helpful. That's it from my side.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else like to share?
I would just like to invite Kathleen, having been through that experience, and if you were to have a replay of that experience and zoom out from it, knowing how the macro level factors influence, there's so many lessons learned there, and how are you applying them to your current work?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I think I've come to the conclusion that, you hear people say lots of times, and this is, a global phenomenon. People say, oh, I don't believe in regrets. I don't have any regrets. I just don't trust people who don't have regrets, I guess. So if any of you don't have any regrets, sorry. I just, I guess I can only speak for myself. I do look back and replay, and I think as leaders, we must look back and replay the decisions that we made and the information that we tried to glean and all of that. So Rick, in response to your question, if I had to replay the scenario, I would, I would weigh much more heavily the opportunities that we are often offered in terms of roles, responsibilities, all of that, the experiences that we get to have. And when we are teachers, when we are educators and leaders, and I think about this in the IT realm with the work that we do with Witty all the time with members, we are beholden to certain things that we promise to members. And I underestimated the impact that I could have had I stayed in that leadership role in that school. Things would be different for those kids had I stayed in the leadership role at the school. And yes, broader impact, all of that. But I think sometimes we, and maybe this is true at different points, on a leadership journey or career pathway, but we're always looking forward and we forget to look at the ground that's right in front of us. And I feel like in some ways I was looking forward and looking up, and I allowed myself to think that the ground would take care of itself, and it didn't. And so, you know what, and the students that left Smiley, they're fine. Like I said, I'm still in touch with a lot of those kids and have gotten to work with many of those students in DPS contexts. But I will tell you that 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to lead the executive search for the superintendent of Denver Public Schools, and had a chance to directly impact a choice 10 years later, literally 10 years later. And we hired Dr. Alex Marrero, who came from New Rochester in New York and is a ferocious equity proponent. And that gave me some closure in making sure that we had someone who was going to dial all the way back to, we're going to make sure that each and every student has equitable access to resources and supports that I feel like had been missing in the district for a minute. So that felt like a little bit of recompense for me. But at the same time, I am not at all shy about saying that decision to leave my kids and leave the school for a different opportunity is something that I truly think about every single day.
Thank you very much. Just I just want to put something into the chat box, because one of the things that, as I was listening to your story, I was using my own zoom lens of zooming in and zooming out. And if we don't zoom out far enough, we can't see the complexities of these interrelated wicked problems. We just focus on this piece here, this piece here. If you don't have a holistic perspective, you can't shift things. And I just want to put a definition that comes from the article. People can look at it later. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to bring attention to it, which is equity meta governance. And that's a concept I'll put in the chat, but we don't have to talk about it here. But I just want people to look. Unless we zoom out and look at the big perspective, then you're just, shifting the what's the expression on the shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic. So anyway, any other reactions? Elizabeth, it looks as though you would like to say something.
Yes. Well, first, Kathleen, thank you very much for sharing and to share with such openness, and also your own reflections, thinking about that narrative as one of many in this world of equity and inequity. If we think about the, beyond that one scenario, like what is the information that can give us to help propel a future that that scenario doesn't play out, and it's not just that one scenario. It's sort of like, what are the ingredients, what are the mineral rights of that experience that bring us to a different place of understanding, sort of from because in many ways there's like this sort of, and you mentioned this naivete, this unknowingness, and I'll call it an unknowingness, to a knowingness, right? And then how does that really lift in a way that's more broadly available to the entire mycelium network of actors that are trying to involve, and move equity upwards? I'm sort of, dancing around the, I'm thinking to myself, and I'm wondering if others, not just you, but everybody, what can we excavate from this that lifts the broader objective of solving wicked problems around equity?
I just wanted to add to that, I think this would be a great movie script. I love that. This is a compelling story. And one of the ways that we learn and that we teach each other is through storytelling. And I think this is a great opportunity to have people be able to see the micro, to see how these individual experiences can contribute to the big picture. And I would love to see this turned into a movie with a story of how one can come back and say, this is what I've learned, and this is what I think we can do. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Linda, you just raised something. I just can't help, but I'm having a conversation, and David, you know who this is, Ian Winter, next week about this very issue, which is how can we have sort of documentaries or stories that get the light of day? And I asked Kathleen, have you written up your story? There's so many of these stories that get buried, they're never told in a way. And just imagine if we could actually develop not just an equity story movement, but also something that's ongoing that highlights what positive things are actually shifting the needle in the right direction. So I completely concur with you. The media and social media do not put the spotlight on these positive stories. And that's to the detriment of trying to work on inequities.
So
I'd like to, Kathleen, that story was so deeply moving. And I just put myself right into that school when you were telling it. I was one of the students, so grateful for you. in your being there and feeling you saved my life by being there. I could feel every emotion they must have felt. And that was such a courageous, such an important thing that you did. Thank you so much for being who you are.
I would also like, Wayne, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but you've been a very good listener. And if you feel like saying something, we've got 5 minutes left. If you don't, that's fine too. But as one of the only 3 men in the room, do you have any perspective you'd like to share? If not, that's fine.
I was kind of struck by that because I had the opposite. I went to Booker T. Washington Junior High during that, the times you're talking about. So my experience was exactly opposite of, that. And so I just I'm worried, very worried that we're othering, that with all the othering that's going on, that we're not really looking at creating opportunities for people, being equitable in the opportunities. We're more focused on outcomes, and this is not a good way. It's not a good place. It's not a good outlook. You have to treat people the way that you want to be treated, and so it's really what I'm taking away from this.
So that, Wayne, you're right. And that's why it is so more important than ever that those of us who happen to be born with white skin stand up and be a very, very strong voice for those people who are not listened to and are diminished on so many levels in society. We cannot stay silent.
Carolyn, to that point, there was just one quick punctuation on that story. There was a gentleman that, and I didn't really know this, or I didn't recognize this until years after the experience at Smiley, but people were, they were glad that somebody was willing to take the wheel at that school. They were also deeply concerned, they were concerned, something is going to happen that this new leader is not going to know how to handle. They hadn't seen me run down the hall in high heels at that point, so they didn't know that I could handle things. But anyway, a lot of people took me under their wing. And one was named Gully Stanford, and Gully was a leader at the College Board. And so the College Board, if you know anything about secondary assessment, responsible for the assessments that students take to, or at least used to take to be considered for college. And anyway, Gully would come and scoop me up out of the building and, took me to meet the mayor and meet the governor and, all that kind of thing. He was connected in that way. And I remember when I found out about the outcomes that I shared with this group, I remember being in the car with Gully out in front of my school. And I said to him, Gully, I am so tired. I'm just physically and emotionally tired. And he said something that I will never forget. And he said, but don't they deserve our fatigue? Wow. And I think about that every day when it's being tired of supporting these issues or tired of responding or just tired from the weight of society. I think about what Gully said, and that is, don't they deserve our fatigue? And so that's everybody that we serve in Whitty. It's every member of our team. It's our family. It's this group. And they do, because indeed, I think that's the only way that we can support them is to fight through the fog of fatigue and just keep, I'll borrow Elizabeth's word, keep excavating the things that we can't yet see that we need to see.
I will say that to myself every time I'm exhausted. That's really inspiring. Thank you.
I like that you said that, because it is, if you're fatigued, can imagine the people that have to go through it and live their lives 100% of the time fatigued. And if you want to do some research, William Smith coined the phrase, racial battle fatigue. So that's something y'all can look up.
And I think that it's closely related to moral distress, dealing with, recognizing that the unfairness, the inequity. And I think we could learn a lot from those scenarios of battle fatigue, moral distress, and battle fatigue. Thank you for bringing that up.
Maybe just to wrap it up a little bit, people who are equity muses need to have some self-compassion because, I mean, that comes from the healthcare field, and it's a way of dealing with burnout, that you do get to a point where you feel burnt out, and how do you replenish yourself and develop the resilience to keep on going, which is a challenge, a real challenge. And just closing things up, I've put the link into the blog post. If people want to add comments about this experience, I'd love you to anything that comes top of mind for you. If you'd like to add something, because one of the things I'm trying to do is create a tapestry of conversations, which is difficult to do. How do you keep these threads going such that you can have a more concerted effort to actually move towards the idea of equity meta governance, which is defined in the article, but you can go and contemplate that at your own time and leisure. So David, any closing remarks, if I can get his attention? He's obviously multitasking, I can see, because he has to. David, are you there or not? Maybe not. Anyway, so any last comments? And then if the co-hosts have time, it'd be nice just to hang out for a couple of minutes at the end, just to sort of reflect about what this, how we can use this type of learning platform for carrying equity forward. So any closing comments from anybody?
Just thank you, Kathleen, for sharing. Really appreciate that narrative, and I'll be definitely contemplating the question that I asked and that others have posited.
Thank you.
And same here, that it's up to each of us individually. The only thing that we can do is try to be the best that we can be. And that we're human, we need to have compassion for ourselves, to echo Rick's sentiments.
Anyone else like to closing comments or take-home messages? Anyone who hasn't spoken so far?
I'll go. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for sharing your story, and Rick for hosting this this call. I think there was a lot of stories that were shared, and I think they're very powerful in terms of how we can help these people. And fortunately, I had the privilege not to experience the school that you worked at, Kathleen. And I think that when we are working in these scenarios on how we can make things more equitable, to go off of what Rick said about perspectives of zooming in and zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, we can also look at this perspective of, a lack of a better word, the victim in the situation. In this situation, I guess we would be portrayed as the heroes, but when we are trying to solve these solutions and these problems, the best way to solve them is actually speaking to the people who are facing this problem, because it's important to have that perspective, because us as the hero per se, we can sympathize and be compassionate about the situation, but we will never fully understand from a first person perspective what they face. So it's always good to speak to those people and understand what are the voices that you have at your table, and who are you speaking to.
Speaking of heroes, Kathleen, we don't have time, but it's a question for future conversation, is who's the hero of your story for about your advocacy for equity? In my article, I said my mother was, but we don't have time to go down that But it's important not only to think of what, if you are taking on, but who was your hero? Who was the person who influenced you to be sensitive to these issues in the first place? So there's always more than one hero in every story, and we need to bring together heroicism in a broader sense rather than focusing on individual heroes, because our individual heroes can't solve our complex web of wicked problems because it takes all of us to do it. So on that note, I think we've wrapped up the session. If Linda, Kathleen, and Elizabeth have a few minutes, we could just, and I think Carolyn's already gone. So if you're too busy, no worries, but we're wrapping up. So David has left us to close. So any comments before we go? Lots of work. Yes, indeed. Who's your hero? I agree with you. Lots of homework, endless homework. Anybody else? Okay, well, you're free to go, and we'll just have a quick debrief for the people, for the co-hosts here. You're welcome to stay if you want. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, just from
Are we
an
still
old-
streaming? Are we still?
I don't know if we are, but just assume that we are. He can cut it off. I'm not sure. But no, there are a couple of things for me. One is we had a plan that, I always put a plan in and then see where it deviates. So we obviously deviates from the plan, which was fine from my point of view. It's a question of, well, how can we carry this forward? And the conversation we had with Carolyn a moment ago was, well, do we use storytelling and then what can we learn from those stories versus people coming up with current challenges that they're facing and how to deal with it? And my response to Carolyn is both and. There's so much we can learn from stories, such as the one Kathleen has never published so far. I encourage you to write it up if you have the courage to do so. Because these stories get buried and we don't learn from them. We don't have a way of, sharing them in ways that other people can benefit from it. But equally important is if you're living through them, imagine, Kathleen, had you had the opportunity of a consultant at that stage when things were going on, and if you did a replay again and had the consultant that you would have loved to have had but didn't, which may now well be that type of consultant, how can you help principals or anybody else with significant to be able to be more resourceful in dealing with inequity? So that's my closing comments.
Yeah, I think, Rick, just in quick response to that, as I mentioned, my primary work now is leadership coaching and executive coaching. And so I work with principals literally all across the country in their teams in doing anti-bias training, establishing interview protocols to ensure competency-based processes that are, through the lens of equity. So I feel like I'm constantly trying to make up for the things that happened in this scenario, always with the faces of my kids and their families in mind. So, and it's joyful work. It's hard work, but it's wonderful, wonderful work to be able to pour into processes in this way.
So, Rick, in response to your question specifically, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, just because I'm in my car, I'm never quite sure. I think the story was illustrious for all the reasons that you and Kathleen brought to life. I mean, you really get the feel in a way that brings it home. I love that we're anchoring in story and in terms of the various threads, and I can see what you're describing, Rick. It's like we're talking about different things and how do they kind of cohere to create, that creates a sort of a forward momentum, separate and in addition to just the very notion of having the conversation lifts all of our cybernetics, right? Like, I mean, each of us in our own internal landscape are lifted and improve, and get more courage, right, from this very convening. So there's sort of the ripple effects of just the dialogue itself and the fact that we're holding space for the listening that is useful. And I understand the point you're making about how do we get, sort of like particle and wave, how do we get the story, the sort of concrete example that is the particle, and then how do we create the wave that ultimately translates this into the world that has more potential to influence other, not to torture the metaphor, but other particles and other circumstances, right? And I think that's what, forgive me, Rick, but is that what you're asking?
Actually, that's fine. Yes. Linda, do you have any last comments or not?
Let's see now. So actually, Preeti has been asking some questions here, and she wanted to know how to connect with all of us. And I suggest that she reach out to us via LinkedIn. She was asking about her crowdfunding story, but I suggested she reach out to David directly. So there might be
actually
another.
that is quite connected to today's topic. So that's why I just wanted to take opportunity. But anyway, it's up to you.
I think there's probably a different forum, and I didn't want to discourage you. So there's just, oh my gosh. Well, now back to the whole issue of equity. There are days, I have to admit, that I just feel a bit overwhelmed with this, because I see it at so many levels. But my students do help me regenerate and inspire me. Kathleen, I suspect you probably, your student serve as an inspiration, have served as an inspiration to you. And it's breaking it down into little further mini categories, I think is one of the ways. But Rick, I think that the storytelling issue is great. And yeah, I would love to hear how that turns out, because I think we do. I think we learn, when I go to the movies, when I'm watching there's often an underlying, sometimes not so subtle message. And we use it to help teach each other about how we're all interconnected. Things like Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, or even Guardians of the Galaxy. So I think it's a powerful tool. And yeah, I would love to continue that conversation, and love to hear about how it goes with your conversation next week.
Yeah, just very briefly, actually, Linda, while you're here, actually, what I would like to be able to do is sort of like have a featured, give advance warning for, so if you're interested in sharing your own inequity stories and having an opportunity to do it. I'm still playing around with the format. I suggested a format that we didn't use today, but it's a trial and error process, and there's different strategies for it. But one idea that I did bring up with David was actually if once a month is very light in terms of trying to do something. And what I suggested to them, what happens if this were to be weekly, but we were to have a lineup of female leader speakers over, say from the fall until June, and use that as a way of compiling stories, writing them up and putting them into a book, so that because some of these stories are very compelling and there's so much to be learned from them. But unless we have a way of transmitting, whether it's books, through podcasts, through whatever, it's very difficult to make to have an impact.
You probably could get enough speakers, but once a week might be a bit much, especially if you're going to ask people to make the commitment to be there. But maybe twice weekly. Go ahead.
I would sort of suggest, I mean, maybe it's just 90 minutes will change the game. Because Rick, and I apologize, I didn't really follow your instructions because I read it yesterday or whatever and forgot. So I know a little extra time, but I know you're trying to get some triads. I suggest 90 minutes is a good time to do it, because that extra 30 minutes would have allowed for furthering. And then, just maybe have somebody be a timekeeper for the group so that we can kind of keep ourselves on track. And then as it relates to story, I think coming up with, as these are recorded, rather than, in a way, the books are less accessible, I mean, great to do it if you want, but the accessibility is these types of formats where people speaking, that's sort of we're oral tradition. That's how we transmit information. It's why Kathleen's story was so compelling. So just encourage, maybe think that you already have the format here. It's just taking a chunk of that and maybe repurposing it on a channel and pushing it out to everybody who participates. And we could push that clip out to all of our network. I mean, I've 33,000 people in my LinkedIn alone, right? And I'm sure you all have a lot of people. And so each of the participants pushing it out, and then the witty community pushing it out. I mean, that could be a way to really get the gist of, the nuggets out.
I think it needs a multimedia strategy, social media, written format. People have different. I mean, I'm a little skeptical about books, but they are like a calling card. It's people don't necessarily have to read the book, but they see it, and it might draw people in. And if you think about how to bring things together, if you're already doing it and it's repurposing something that's already done in a different format. I don't know what the adage is, but it just needs a much wider strategy. And this obviously needs a longer conversation, but at least we're planting more seeds here. Unfortunately, I have to go because somebody's just come to my house and I have to go deal with somebody who's supposed to be giving an estimate on something on our yard. So I gotta go, I'm afraid. So thanks for the chat.
Very nice to see you, Rick.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Good to see you. Kathleen, nice to see you.